This is Land of Havilah, Daniel 11b. The first part of the chapter was a detailed prophecy of the Ptolemies and Seleucids received by Daniel in a vision in about 536 BC, which came to pass from 323 to 175 BC. We left off with the rise of Antiochus IV Epiphanes in the north, who has dominion over the Promised Land. We're familiar with him from the prophecies of chapters 7 and 8. He was the little horn of chapter 7 who spoke great things and stamped the remnant of the Jews with his feet. And in chapter 8 he committed an abomination of desolation, which was that he profaned the temple. Now the prophecy of Antiochus IV Epiphanes rising up in the north in the place of Seleucus IV, verse 21. In his place a contemptible person will stand up, to whom they had not given the honor of the kingdom, but he will come in time of security and will obtain the kingdom by flatteries. The overwhelming forces will be overwhelmed from before him and will be broken. Yes, also the prince of the covenant. After the treaty made with him, he will work deceitfully, for he will come up and will become strong with a small people. In time of security he'll come even on the fattest places of the province. He'll do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He'll scatter among them prey, plunder, and substance. Yes, he'll devise his plans against the strongholds, even for a time. Comment in verse 21, Antiochus Epiphanes had not been given the honor of the kingdom. In fulfillment, he wasn't the rightful heir of the throne. He seized it with a combination of force and conniving. He was contemptible, as verse 21 says. He called himself Epiphanes to suggest he was a manifestation of Zeus. But behind his back they called him Epimanes, which means madman. In fulfillment of verse 22, to take control of the kingdom, he overcame and broke overwhelming forces who were backing his rivals. In verse 22, he would overwhelm and break the prince of the covenant. In fulfillment, he deposed the Jewish high priest Onias III, who was later murdered. In verse 23, after a treaty, he'll work deceitfully and become strong with a small people. Antiochus started with only a few supporters, but formed alliances to claim the throne, including that he made a treaty with Ptolemy VI of Egypt. But the treaty was a deceit because Antiochus later betrayed Ptolemy. In verse 24, he would come on the fattest places of the province and do what his fathers didn't do, taking prey, plunder, and substance. In fulfillment, Antiochus plundered temples in his own lands and any other riches he could lay his hands on to fund his ambitions. Verse 25. He'll stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army, and the king of the south will wage war in battle with an exceedingly great and mighty army, but he won't stand, for they'll devise plans against him. Yes, those who eat of his dainties will destroy him, and his army will be swept away. Many will fall down slain. Comment verses 25 and 26 are pretty plain that Antiochus Epiphanes would wage war with the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt, and despite Ptolemy VI having a great army, he couldn't withstand the attack because of internal plots devised against him. Those who ate his dainties destroyed him, which means his leaders who ate at his table betrayed him. This was about 170 BC, verse 27. As for both these kings, their hearts will be to do mischief, and they'll speak lies at one table, but it won't prosper, for the end will still be at the appointed time. Comment in fulfillment of verse 27, Antiochus Epiphanes and Ptolemy VI sat at the same negotiating table, lied to each other, and formed a treaty that didn't last. Verse 28. Then he'll return into his own land with great wealth. His heart will be against the holy covenant. He'll take action and return to his own land. Comment in verse 28, there was exact fulfillment that when Antiochus was done in Egypt, he returned to his own land with great plunder. On that trip he passed through Judea and took action against the holy covenant, that is, the covenant between the Jews and God, by killing many Jews and plundering Yahweh's temple. Coming up, it's predicted that Antiochus will return to Egypt, but he won't succeed like he did the first time. Verse 29. He'll return at the appointed time and come into the south, but it won't be in the latter time as it was in the former. For ships of Kittim will come against him, therefore he will be grieved and will return and have indignation against the holy covenant and will take action. He'll even return and have regard to those who forsake the holy covenant. Forces will stand on his part, and they'll profane the sanctuary, even the fortress, and will take away the continual burnt offering. Then they will set up the abomination that makes desolate. He'll corrupt those who do wickedly against the covenant by flatteries, but the people who know their God will be strong and take action. In fulfillment of verses 29 and 30, Antiochus returned to Egypt in 168, but retreated because Roman ships from Kittim, which is Cyprus, came to support Egypt. On his way back through Judea, he had regard for those who forsook the Holy Covenant, which means he supported Jews who rejected the covenant with God and supported him. In fulfillment of verse 31 regarding the abomination which makes desolate, he desecrated the temple. He took away the continual burnt offering, erected an altar of Zeus over Yahweh's altar, sacrificed pigs on it, and set up an idol to Zeus in the temple. The year was 167 B.C. About 199 years later, Jesus said, "When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of in the prophet Daniel, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains," Matthew 24:15 and 16. There's a note to the reader attached to that verse that says, "Let the reader understand." The thing we need to understand is that Jesus was citing a desolation of the past, the desolation of Antiochus Epiphanes, and saying it would take place again in the future. There would be a likeness of Antiochus to arise in the future, a future leader who would do many of the same things in terms of desecrating the temple and persecuting the Jews and all God's people. And according to Jesus, this would occur during the Great Tribulation, which was what he called that time in verse 21. Moving on in Daniel 11 to verse 32, Antiochus would corrupt those who do wickedly against the covenant, which means he would corrupt some of the Jews to support him. Then the people who know their God will be strong and take action. This is a prediction of the Jewish Maccabean revolt against Antiochus, which was successful and is celebrated today by the Jewish holiday season called Hanukkah. It's here that we should pause and acknowledge the accuracy and detail of these prophecies, not just here in chapter 11, but also in chapters 2, 7, and 8. It's to the point that we'll either dismiss all this as a forgery or agree there's such a thing as a supernatural. Now there will be 3 verses of fast forwarding, let's call it. Unlike the previous verses in this chapter that point to very specific events, these verses coming up are very vague and describe things only in general terms. It's a statement about all times, not specific times. It's what will take place in the long gap of time between Antiochus Epiphanes and the arrival of his counterpart, the Antichrist, in the time of the end. Verse 33. Those who are wise among the people will instruct many, yet they'll fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder many days. Now when they fall, they'll be helped with a little help, but many will join themselves to them with flatteries. Some of those who are wise will fall, to refine them and to purify and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for the time appointed. In verse 33, those who are wise among the people will instruct many, which means there'll be some good teachers and leaders along the way. Yet they'll fall to the sword, flame, captivity, and plunder, which means true leaders of the faith will be at risk of persecution and martyrdom. This will go on many days, which means for a long time. This is the long period of time between Antiochus and the Antichrist, and all this persecution will be especially true in the times of Antiochus and the Antichrist. In verse 33, the true teachers will be helped with a little help, which means some will be faithful and support the true leaders, but many will join themselves to them with flatteries, which means there will always be insincere, self-serving hypocrites among the flock. The sincere are the few, they're the little help, and the insincere are the many. Jesus said many are going to destruction and few to life. Matthew 7:13-14. In verse 35, some of those who are wise will fall, which means they'll be martyred. It doesn't mean they'll fall from the faith, because if they're going to do that, they wouldn't have been called wise in the first place. The persecution will refine, purify, and make them white, which means if they're wise, persecution will only make them stronger, and redound to their eternal benefit. In verse 35, these things will apply even to the time of the end, because it's yet for the time appointed, which means persecutions will take place all along, even to and through to the appointed time of the end, especially in the very end. Speaking of the very end, the counterpart to Antiochus Epiphanes, the Antichrist, will arise and accelerate those persecutions. Verse 36, the king will do according to his will. He'll exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and will speak marvelous things against the God of gods. He'll prosper until the indignation is accomplished, for that which is determined will be done. Comment in verse 36, the Antichrist will have his way. He'll magnify himself above every god, which means he'll claim to be the highest God. He'll be intolerant of every religion except the worship of himself. He'll oppose every other god or thing that is worshipped, 2 Thessalonians 2:4. He'll prosper until the indignation is accomplished. So the Great Tribulation will be God's indignation against the world, and the Antichrist will prosper until the end of it. He'll prosper until the final day that Jesus returns and throws him alive into the lake of fire, Revelation 19:20. In verse 36, the Antichrist will speak marvelous things against the God of gods, verse 37. He won't regard the gods of his fathers or the desire of women or regard of any god, for he'll magnify himself above all. But in his place he'll honor the God of fortresses. He'll honor a God whom his fathers didn't know, with gold, silver, and with precious stones and pleasant things. He'll deal with the strongest fortresses by the help of a foreign god. Comment in verse 37, the Antichrist won't have regard for the desire of women. He won't be attracted to women. He might be homosexual. And in verse 37, the Antichrist won't have regard for the gods of his fathers. This means he'll come from a religious family background or religious culture, but he will not adhere to that religion. He'll magnify himself. Yet in the next sentence in verse 38, in his place he'll honor the God of fortresses. How is it that he'll oppose everything called God except himself, yet honor the God of fortresses? Revelation 13:4 fills us in that Satan will be the power behind the Antichrist. The Antichrist will honor Satan, but he won't call him that. He'll call him the God of fortresses or strongholds. And since the Antichrist magnifies himself above all, he won't say that the God of the fortresses is superior to him. He'll say he's a manifestation of him, so that when he honors the God of fortresses, he's honoring himself. This is the only way he can magnify himself above all and not be tolerant of any other god, yet at the same time honor the God of fortresses. He'll call himself one with the God of fortresses. This will be reminiscent of the way Antiochus Epiphanes called himself a manifestation of Zeus. Speaking of the Antichrist, still in verse 39, he'll increase with glory whoever acknowledges him. He'll cause them to rule over many and will divide the land for a price. Comment in verse 39, it'll pay to acknowledge the Antichrist. If a person glorifies and honors him, he'll glorify and honor them with kingdoms or whatever. The Antichrist will know how to profit himself and others by the exchange of favors. He'll be very transactional. He'll sell lands for a price. Now comes a series of events that'll be recognizable as a fulfillment of prophecy when they come to pass, but probably not until then. Verse 40. At the time of the end, the king of the south will contend with him, and the king of the north will come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, with horsemen, and with many ships. He'll enter into the countries and will overflow and pass through. Comment in verse 40, the Antichrist will contend with kings from the south and north. Daniel 7:24 said the Antichrist will put down 3 kings. He'll enter into the countries, overflow, and pass through, which means his armies will roll into countries and through them and keep rolling. Speaking of more initiatives, verse 41. He'll also enter into the glorious land, and many countries will be overthrown, but these will be delivered out of his hand, Edom, Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. He'll also stretch out his hand on the countries. The land of Egypt won't escape, but he'll have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. The Libyans and the Ethiopians will be at his steps. But news out of the east and out of the north will trouble him, and he'll go out with great fury to destroy and utterly to sweep away many. He'll plant the tents of his palace between the sea and the glorious holy mountain, yet he'll come to his end, and no one will help him. Comment in verse 41, the Antichrist will enter the glorious land, which is Israel. Jesus implied he would descend on the land the same moment he commits the abomination of desolation, suddenly, and he'll go through with deadly force, Matthew 24:15-20. In verses 41 and 42, Edom, Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon will not escape. These are the lands east and southeast of Israel, and Egypt won't escape. He'll stretch out his hand against all these. However, Libya and Ethiopia will be at his steps, also translated to the effect they'll cooperate with him. The naming of specific nations here in these verses might indicate those nations in particular, or those nations might represent nations across the world that will either cooperate with the Antichrist or be forced to cooperate. In verse 44, news out of the east and north will trouble him, and he'll go out with fury to destroy and utterly sweep away many. Time will tell what the specifics are, but clearly the Antichrist will be ruthless. He'll have no problem with large-scale war and even genocide, such as in Israel, if that's what it takes. He'll utterly sweep away many. In verse 45, he'll plant the tents of his palace between the sea and the glorious mountain, which means he'll make his capital in the Holy Land between the Mediterranean Sea and Jerusalem. This will be convenient to his temple in Jerusalem. In verse 45, he'll come to his end, and no one will help him. The returning Lord Jesus and his heavenly armies will destroy him, Matthew 24:29-31, and Revelation 19:11-20. So that will be his end. Daniel 12 is next.